He was not only a diplomat, he was not only a supreme pontiff, he was a man of prayer. It was obvious when you met him. Here you're facing a deeply spiritual man.
He was a saintly pontiff. When they say that he did nothing to save the Jews, historical documents prove otherwise.
His dilemma was, how does he speak out without endangering them even further? He went to the edge of risk again and again.
Pius' judgment was that he'd be killing more Jews as well as Catholics by speaking out in a fiery way.
So there is this pattern of diplomatic caution, but also very early on, immediately concrete gestures on a local level to do what was possible to try to mitigate the effects of Nazi policies.
Purtroppo si è fatto una leggenda nera nei suoi confronti, parlando del silenzio in rapporto alla Shoah. Questa è una leggenda nera che non ha il vecchio minimo fondamento storico.
Pope's a man trying to do the right thing, make the right decisions in the middle of this horror going on around him, who did save hundreds of thousands of lives.
Our Talmud says if you save a single life, it is that you've saved the whole world. You're assured of the rewards in the world to come. He saved more than a single life.
The real beginning of the kind of anti-Pius XII sentiments didn't come from a Jew at all. It came from Rolf Hochhuth, who was a German.
In 1963, 5 years after the death of Pius XII, a play called The Deputy premiered in Berlin. It attacked the late Pope for his alleged silence during the horrors of the Holocaust. The Deputy was billed as the most controversial play of our time.
It's called The Deputy, or The Vicar in English, Le Vicaire in French, and Der Stellvertreter in the original German. Rolf Hochhuth, the author, a young German Protestant, builds the play around the failure of the late Pope Pius XII to make a specific denunciation of the extermination of Jews in Nazi concentration camps during World War II. The play has already been seen in 9 countries, and everywhere it was shown, Catholics denounced it as a libel on Pope Pius. In at least 3 cities, there were riots: in Basel, Switzerland, in Vienna, and in Paris.
Now, this play says that the Pope did not open his mouth, never said a word. Nobody questions that. He, by not speaking, accepted the death of 6 million human beings.
Of course I did see The Deputy. I don't believe there's a Jewish person who didn't, but it wasn't accurate. I cannot believe Pope Pius XII was looking at the stock market results at time when people were dying and they came to him to ask to intervene. I can't believe that.
It depicts Pope Pius XII as this cold, uncaring, central stationary figure who sort of looks on beyond all of the horror of World War II and the treatment of the Jews. You've got a young priest who's trying to get to the Pope to get him to speak out, but the Pope, will not do that. So, I mean, he's a cold-hearted, evil person, and that play is what largely has been credited with taking Pius XII, who, during the war, at the end of the war, at the time of his death, universally was seen as the one person who really stood up for the Jews and stood in opposition to the Nazis during the Holocaust. This play comes out, really blew everything up.
Not only did The Deputy tell scurrilous tales about Pope Pius XII with no historical basis, the evidence suggests that the play and the black legend it inspired were the handiwork of political enemies of the Pope.
It is a generally known fact that the Russian communists, were deadly opposed to Pius XII. when Hochhuth wrote his play, he had the good fortune that this came into the hands of a famous director, a certain man by the name of Erwin Piscator. Erwin Piscator is of extreme left. During the Nazi period, he fled to Moscow and stayed for years in Moscow, so you can well understand what is behind all this.
Under the failed Weimar Republic, inflation rose so high, Germans began using cash as kindling. The stage was set for the rise of National Socialism. The Nazi Party began its rise to power, feeding off Germany's need for scapegoats. Its ideology stressed racial purity and saw Jews as the greatest obstacle to the future success of Germany.
The difference between the Nazis and the Christian worldview is night and day. The Christian worldview, of course, treat all people with dignity. The Nazis, on the other hand, viewed people distinct based upon race. It's a scientific theory. It grows out of the idea of Darwin and evolution, and the Nazis carefully depicted first people with handicaps, later Jews and gypsies, as drags on society, as entities that were preventing the German Aryan race from advancing.
I think we can be quite confident that Eugenio Pacelli, from a very early date, understood National Socialism for what it was. He saw it as a neo-pagan ideology. He understood that it was at heart violent, that it was an aggressive form of nationalism that ultimately wanted to supplant Christian faith for ultimate faith and subservience to the state.
And the future Pope Pius XII responded to the threat. Of the 44 speeches given by Pacelli during his time as nuncio to Bavaria, 40 denounced some aspect of Nazi ideology, and he had harsh words for Adolf Hitler.
Pacelli came out with a statement in which he said, Hitler is a man who's an egomaniac. He is egocentric. He is a man, anybody who contradicts him has to be torn to pieces. He is capable of walking on corpses. That's what Pacelli said about him in 1929.
But Hitler's rise to power continued unimpeded, and that meant serious problems for the Catholic Church in Germany.
Hitler was very conscious of the power of ideology. His own Nazi ideology survived and flourished because it was so all-pervasive. And there was no other single ideology which could possibly stand up against it other than Catholicism. And he knew this. He was himself, of course, born a Catholic and always spoke very bitterly of his experiences as a young Catholic. He knew, as he perceived it, the strength and, for him, dangers of Catholicism. And so he and the Nazis were very, very conscious that, in a way, how could they compete?
During this period, Pope Pius XI and Vatican diplomats sought to protect the Church from abuse by signing concordats.
A concordat is designed to protect the rights of the Church, often in a hostile nation. If it's with a nation where you have good relations, it's usually not that big of a deal. But the Church wants to be able to hold masses, to have youth groups, to have social functions, to make sure that its priests and its parishioners are not harassed by the authorities. That's essentially what a concordat provides for from the Church's perspective.
The model of concordat had been used extensively since the time of Napoleon. And in fact, it was one of the legacies of the Revolution, French Revolution, and of the Napoleonic period, was to, in a sense, demand of the Holy See some kind of formal diplomatic relationship in which the state sort of gets its interests are protected and the Church is able to win a certain amount of rights and privileges. And I think that logic drove papal diplomacy after 1870.
Diesem Deutschland sind
By the time Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany in 1933, Nuncio Pacelli had risen to the position of Vatican Secretary of State. Working under Pope Pius XI, Pacelli signed the Reich Concordat, an agreement with Nazi Germany that he hoped would protect the Church.
The Concordat was in order to protect the needs of the Catholic Church in Germany. Hitler promised to protect the churches, to protect the Catholics. The Church had to do something to avoid more damage.
When this offer came, they were very reluctant to accept it. But they could not refuse it, because the text that Hitler presented and which he was willing to sign was extremely favorable to the Roman Catholic Church. Would it be possible to say no? What would have been the reaction? The first reaction would be Hitler said, well, I've tendered hand of peace. This hand has been brutally rejected. Well, if you don't want peace, you can have war.
The Concordat, it's very important. The criticism of it is that it says that the Catholic Church will stay out of politics. And to the Nazis, the Jewish question was politics. So they tried to get the Catholic Church not to comment on their treatment of the Jews. The Church, however, insisted on a supplemental protocol. The protocol expressly said that the Church leaders had the right to speak out on issues touching on morality and dogmatic teachings of the Church. That is the legal basis that the bishops and the priests in Germany had, allowing them to do what they did, which was repeatedly speak out about the treatment of Jewish people.
In his 1999 best-selling book, Hitler's Pope, author John Cornwell claimed the Concordat assured Hitler's rise to power by eliminating the Catholic Center Party and all potential opposition to the Nazi regime.
There's a huge factual error right there. The Center Party had collapsed prior to the signing of the Concordat. The Center Party in Germany had capitulated and actually helped Hitler get the Enabling Act through. It actually helped Hitler come to power a little bit because it was so weakened, and the Nazis were beating up the leaders, arresting the leaders, that it was kind of embarrassing to the Vatican that had happened. So the Vatican is trying to protect its rights.
I can't find in the Concordat Nazi sympathies on the part of the Vatican or Pius. I see in it an attempt to protect the Catholic Church from something which clearly is very disturbing. But 1933 was not the Holocaust. 1933 was not mass murder. 1933 was the coming to power of someone with bizarre, racist ideology who might last a year, might last 2 years, might last 2 or 3 months in the chaotic situation in Germany.
But Hitler's promise to protect the Church meant little, as the Vatican and the entire world would soon learn.
Cardinal Pacelli signed the Concordat, and 5 days later, everything Hitler had promised disappeared. He began persecuting the Catholics. The printing presses were closed, churches were closed, youngsters all had to join the Hitler youth groups.
And things would not improve for the Catholic Church or for the Jewish population in Germany. In September 1935, the Nazi Party promulgated the Nuremberg Laws. These race laws severely persecuted Jewish citizens, served as a foreshadowing of the coming Holocaust.
There were 60 protests. The Church did protest. The Secretary of State did protest. Pius XI did protest.
After 4 years, the Vatican lost patience and finally now we go public. And they signed the Pope Pius XI, but with the great help of the Secretary of State Pacelli, came out with the encyclical Mit brennender Sorge. The document had been smuggled by diplomatic sources to the Apostolic Nuncio at Berlin. They got it printed in hundreds of thousands of copies. It was taken over by private means, by motorcycles, even by boys, to all the parishes, to be read out on Palm Sunday in all the masses.
It's a profound statement. It's not written in Latin or in Italian, it's written in German. And it's just an indictment of racism and what's taking place.
There is a statement in there already with reference to St. Paul, and here the Jews are mentioned by name. There is no distinction between Greek and Jews. In other words, the Jews are people as everybody else. The reaction of Hitler was furious. Anybody who was found in the possession of a printed text was liable to end up in prison or concentration camp.
Hitler was particularly enraged because he hated being laughed at, and this suggested he was being laughed at by God in heaven. The Nazis retaliated. They confiscated all copies they could. They broke up printing presses. They arrested people who had helped distribute it. You didn't have free speech in Germany. I mean, it's a crucial thing. People talk about, why weren't there more statements? Well, statements didn't go far, and they ended up often bringing about retaliation.
One dictator by himself is always impressive, often terrifying. When two get together, the result should be twice as effective. But all the same, when dictators meet, it makes big talk. And as Hitler drives with Italy's king, Rome makes a big noise.
When Hitler traveled to Rome in May of 1938, pomp and pageantry were on full display.
And then begins the grand tour.
But there was an icy reception from the Vatican.
Hitler comes down to Rome. Rome gets all decorated up. There were festivals, there were all kinds of stuff. The Vatican went dark. Pius XI and Secretary of State Pacelli went to Castel Gandolfo, closing all the museums, and the instructions were left behind for the priests and nuns not to participate in the celebrations that were taking place. From Castel Gandolfo, Pope Pius XI said, "The air in Rome makes me ill. The cross being worshipped in Rome is not the cross of Christ." Of course, he's talking about the swastika. This was a big insult, a big slap in the face to Hitler.
A different sort of pageantry was on hand on March 2nd, 1939, when Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli was elected the 260th successor to St. Peter. Word of the newly elected Pope was not welcomed in Nazi Germany.
Around the world, this was seen as a great thing, but not in Germany. At the coronation, the German delegation did not show up. I mean, it was a visible protest.
With the threat of war looming over Europe, the new Pope vowed to dedicate his papacy to peace. Pius chose for his coat of arms the image of a dove holding an olive branch in his beak. The new Pope would have little time to settle into his new position as the universal shepherd of the Catholic faithful. Already, war clouds were hovering over Europe.
The Nazis sent the Wehrmacht smashing into Poland. For France and England, faithful to their mutual assistance.
In September 1939, Germany launched its invasion of Poland, beginning the Second World War. Just 1 month later, Pope Pius issued his first papal
there. You can't ignore what they're saying. I mean, when you're faced with an ideology that has decided that one nation, one race is greater than all others, and certain races or groups need to be eliminated in order for the greatness of that one race to be realized. When a pope comes along and says, you know, we are all children of one God, when he uses words like the unity of humanity.
I think Pius XII was in a very difficult situation because he was receiving information all the time, not only about the mass murder of Jews, but also the mass murder of Catholics. They singled out Catholic priests and Catholic leaders and executed them in the thousands and tens of thousands in order to try to destroy what they saw as this threat from Catholicism.
Pius dealt with folks the same way, whether you're talking about Jewish peasants or Catholic priests. We didn't see a bunch of verbal protests on behalf of, let the priest go, let the priest go, let the priest go, while you're ignoring the Jews. If we saw that, then maybe there'd be a case, say he's an anti-Semite or something. But he dealt with Catholic priests the same way he dealt with Jewish peasants. Which indicates, to me, I think he was doing what he thought was the right thing to do. He wrote a very strong statement once and had it smuggled into Poland to be read in Poland. The cardinal in Poland took the letter and burned it and wrote a letter back to the Pope and said, "This will get people killed."
A public statement may have gotten people killed, but Pius XII did not shy away from strong words and actions behind the scenes. This was clearly seen in a private audience with German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop in March of 1940.
Ribbentrop walked into Pacelli's office and began telling him what the Germans were going to do.
About to be encircled, the Nazis made their ignominious retreat out of Rome. Hitler's oil-starved war machine used any available vehicle for the exodus, a retreat that spelled the end of Nazi domination for Italy. The celebrations were saved until the conquering Fifth Army made its appearance. With the last Nazi routed, Rome, after 4 years, was free to rejoice in her liberation. Pope Pius gives audience to Allied soldiers for the first time since the war began. The Pontiff already had given thanks that Rome had been spared the ravages of battle. And here he meets some 4,000 fighters who freed the Italian capital from Nazi tyranny.
You know very well, you have had experience now of the dangers and uncertainties of life in the midst of a war. Make one thing certain, that you keep always close to God.
When Hitler and the Third Reich were defeated in 1945, Pius XII was universally praised for his wartime efforts. The World Jewish Congress even made a financial gift to the Vatican in recognition of its work to oppose the Nazis. Jewish leaders from around the world spoke out in thanksgiving for Pius XII's hand of peace for his Jewish brothers and sisters.
I see them coming out of a passion, saying, wow, here is a man who went out of his way and he saved people. And they spoke their heart and gave me heart and feeling that the church did some great things.
When you see the praise given to Pius by Jewish leaders, you have to ask yourself, well, why were they praising him? After all, at that time in the Jewish world, there was understandably great bitterness and anger at all the people who had been connivers and collaborators and silent bystanders of what had happened. The fact that Pius XII was singled out immediately after the war by those who knew what had happened as someone who had helped should be the clue for the historian that these people had no reason to flatter a pope. If they had any reason to expose him, they would have done so.
When Pius XII passed away in October of 1958, it brought to an end a nearly 20-year papacy. The outpouring of love and admiration was unusual even for Vatican standards. 53 nations sent representatives to the funeral mass, including the State of Israel.
When Pius XII died, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, Golda Meir, came out with a glowing tribute to what he had done for the Jews. The Prime Minister of Israel, Moshe Sharet, came especially to Rome and said, one of my first tasks is to thank you for what you have been doing for the Jews during the terrible time of the persecution by the Nazis.
Virtually every major Jewish group in the United States and Canada and throughout the world issued condolences, thanks, all kinds of statements of how this had been the one guy who had stood behind them. And that was the universal perception from the point of his death until the deputy in 1963.
Since Pacelli's death, the Catholic Church has taken huge strides in forging closer relations with the Jewish faith. The Second Vatican Council's historic document, Nostra Aetate, opened up bold new paths for Catholic-Jewish relations. Pope John Paul II was credited with taking the vision of Vatican II and turning it into reality. He became the first pope to step foot in a Jewish synagogue, and he spoke of Jews as the elder brothers of Christians. In 1998, Jean Paul issued a 14-page document, We Remember, a reflection on the Shoah. It called on Christians to repent for the persecution of Jews throughout church history and for the silence and inaction of some Catholics during the Holocaust. But the document defended the actions of Pope Pius XII, and today his cause for beatification moves closer to becoming reality.
Clearly, the Catholic Church has repudiated anti-Semitism, has made enormous strides in its relations with the Jews.
I was there in Israel when John Paul II placed that which has happened in the past. He reaches forth his hand in friendship. For God's sakes, let's grab that hand and work together for a better world.
Are we close to God?
Let us remember some key facts about this man's story and about history. Pope Pius XII led the Catholic Church from 1939 to 1958. Immediately before his election, the then Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli was the Vatican Secretary of State. He, more than anyone else in the Vatican, knew what was happening in the world. Pius XII was not only the Pope of the Second World War, but a pastor who, from March 2, 1939 to October 9, 1958, had before him a world at war during very troubled times. Those who attack Pius XII often do so for ideological reasons. The campaign against him was started in the Soviet Union and was then sustained in various Catholic environments. He took sides against the communist world in a severe, strong, and determined way, in such a way that we had to wait 30 years until the Polish Karol Wojtyła was elected Pope, for that style to be taken up properly in a way that was fatal for communism. From the beginning, Hitler and his closest followers were motivated by a pathological hatred for the Catholic Church, which they appraised correctly as the most dangerous opponent to what they hoped to do in Germany. There was radical divergence between the Nazis and the Catholic Church. Pope Pius XII was not concerned for his reputation, but with saving Jewish lives, and this was the only just decision, which clearly required wisdom and a great amount of courage. The Pope protested vehemently the persecution of Jews, but he explained in 1943 that he could not speak in more dramatic or public terms without the risk of making things much worse than they were. His was a prophecy in action, rather than potentially counterproductive public statements, which saved the lives of countless victims of the neo-pagan Nazi reign of terror. During the Second World War, and up until 5 years after his death, Pius XII was greatly praised by many Jewish organizations, chief rabbis of diverse countries, and especially from the United States. Robert Kempner, a Jewish lawyer and public official at the Nuremberg trials, wrote in 1964, after the appearance of Rolf Hochhuth's The Deputy, any propagandistic position that the Church would have taken against Hitler's government would have not only provoked suicide, but would have hastened the execution of still more Jews and priests. One of the unpleasant secondary consequences of this black legend that falsely portrays Pius XII as indulgent towards Nazism and indifferent to the fate of the victims of persecution has been to sideline or even obliterate the extraordinary teaching of this Pope, who was a precursor of the Second Vatican Council. Pius XII must be remembered for his encyclical on the liturgy, his reform of the rites of Holy Week, the great preparatory work that would flow into the conciliar liturgical reform. It is the same Pope who, in the encyclical Humani Generis, takes evolutionary theory into consideration. Pius XII also gave notable impetus to missionary activity with the encyclicals Evangelii Precones in 1951 and Fidei Donum in 1957, highlighting the Church's duty to proclaim the gospel to the nations, as Vatican II would amply reaffirm. Papa Pacelli opened up the application of the historical critical method to sacred scriptures, and in the encyclical Divino Afflante Spiritu established the doctrinal norms for the study of sacred scripture, emphasizing the importance of its role in Christian life. After sacred scripture, the Council's documents cite no single author as frequently as Pope Pius XII.